In the heart of the Holy Roman Church, a man sat on the throne of St. Peter. To the world, he was the vicar of Christ, a symbol of absolute purity and God's will on earth. But behind the sacred walls of the Vatican, beneath the gilded ceilings and whispered prayers, he was something else entirely. He was a father, not just to the faithful flock who knelt before him, but to a dynasty of his own blood, born and raised in the very shadows he was meant to cast out. This is the story of a pope whose piety was a performance, and whose true legacy was not written in scripture, but in the faces of his many forbidden children. This was the late 15th century, an age of breathtaking arts and brutal ambition. Renaissance Rome was a city of saints and assassins, where the scent of incense often mixed with the faint smell of poison. Power was the ultimate currency, and the papacy was its grandest prize. The men who sought it, the cardinals of the church, were princes in their own right, their loyalties bought and sold in the shadowed corridors of power. It was in this crucible of piety and politics that a Spanish cardinal named Rodrigo Borgia saw his path to glory. He was charismatic, intelligent, and possessed an insatiable hunger for influence. When the papal throne became vacant, he moved with the precision of a master strategist, using his immense wealth to secure the votes he needed. He promised reform, a return to spiritual purity, a steady hand to guide the faithful through troubled times. And so, the white smoke rose. The world celebrated his ascension, believing a new era of devotion was at hand. They had no idea the man they now called Pope Alexander VI was about to unleash a storm of scandal and nepotism that would shake Christendom to its very foundations. His reign would not be remembered for its holiness, but for the dark, damning secret he could no longer contain. From the moment he placed the papal tiara upon his head, Pope Alexander VI began to lead two entirely separate lives. In the public eye, he was everything a pope should be. He celebrated Mass with solemn grandeur in the new Sistine Chapel, its ceiling not yet touched by Michelangelo's genius. He was a shrewd diplomat who navigated the treacherous politics of the Italian states, a patron of the arts who commissioned great works to glorify God and the Church. He spoke of virtue, of celibacy, of the sacred vows that bound clergymen to a life of spiritual devotion. His sermons were eloquent, his presence commanding. To the pilgrims who journeyed thousands of miles to receive his blessing, he was the living embodiment of Christ's authority on earth. But when the sun set over Rome and the great bronze doors of the apostolic palace were bolted shut, another world came to life. The solemnity of the day gave way to nights of astonishing decadence. The papal apartments, meant for prayer and contemplation, were transformed into halls of lavish feasts and riotous entertainment. The finest foods, the rarest wines, and the most beautiful music filled the air. These were not gatherings of pious scholars, but of corrupt cardinals, loyal sycophants, and powerful allies, all of them there to bask in the glow of the Borgia Pope. And at the heart of this hidden court was the Pope's most guarded secret, his family. For decades before becoming Pope, Cardinal Borgia had maintained a long-term relationship with a woman named Vanosa di Catane. She was not his wife in the eyes of the law, but she was the mother of his four most beloved children, Giovanni, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. The clergy's vow of celibacy was a rule often broken in private, but Rodrigo Borgia didn't just break it, he shattered it. He didn't just have children, he adored them, doted on them, and saw in them the future of his own dynastic power. While he was a cardinal, their existence was a poorly kept secret among the Roman elite, but as pope, the stakes were infinitely higher. He could not acknowledge them as his own. Instead, a clever fiction was created. His children were officially presented to the world as his nieces and nephews. They were given palaces to live in, tutors to educate them, and limitless funds from the church's treasury to support their lavish lifestyles. They were Borgias, living under the Pope's personal protection, a family hidden in plain sight. This deception was the cornerstone of his reign, a lie whispered in the very heart of the supposed truth. The Holy Father, the spiritual guide for hundreds of millions of souls, was using the wealth and power of the church not just for personal indulgence, but to build a political dynasty for his illegitimate sons and daughter. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and it was only just beginning. As Pope Alexander's reign continued, the line between his sacred duties and his paternal ambitions blurred until they disappeared completely. The Vatican ceased to be merely the headquarters of the Catholic Church. It became the strategic command center for House Borgia. His children were not just family, they were his most valuable assets, pawns to be moved across the Italian political chessboard.
His eldest son, Giovanni, was made Duke of Gandia, a commander of the papal armies, despite his lack of military skill. The Pope showered them with titles and land, hoping to establish a hereditary Borgia dominion in central Italy. His youngest son, Geoffrey, was married into the royal house of Naples, securing a crucial southern alliance. But it was his other two children, Cesare and Lucrezia, who would become the most infamous symbols of his corrupt reign. Lucrezia Borgia, renowned for her beauty and grace, became the Pope's ultimate diplomatic tool. She was married off at the age of 13 to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, to secure an alliance with the powerful Sforza family of Milan. When that alliance was no longer useful, the Pope manufactured a reason to have the marriage annulled, humiliating her husband in the process. She was then married to another political target, and then another. Her life was a series of strategic unions, each one designed to further her father's political goals. Rumors, dark and venomous, began to swirl around her, painting her as a poisoner and a woman of loose morals. Rumors likely spread by her family's enemies, but which stuck to her name for centuries. Then there was Cesare. Intelligent, ruthless, and utterly without conscience, Cesare was his father's favorite. Alexander first made him a cardinal at the tender age of 18, a shocking act of nepotism even for that era. But Cesare had no interest in the church. He yearned for the battlefield. In an unprecedented move, he resigned his cardinality, trading his red robes for a suit of armor. With his father's blessing and the church's money, he carved out a brutal and bloody kingdom for himself in the Romagna region of Italy. He became the very model for Machiavelli's prince, a man who believed that fear was a better tool than love, and that the ends always justified the means. He moved with a terrifying efficiency, his father, the Pope, providing the diplomatic cover and the financial fuel for his conquests. While his children consolidated power across Italy, Alexander's own behavior grew more audacious. The papal court became notorious throughout Europe for its depravity. Stories began to leak out of the Vatican, stories of wild parties that lasted for days. The most infamous of these was the so-called Banquet of the Chestnuts, an alleged supper hosted by Cesare in the papal palace. Chroniclers of the time wrote of 50 courtesans dancing and entertaining the guests, an event of such scandalous debauchery that it seemed almost unbelievable. Whether every detail was true or exaggerated by his enemies, the story spread like wildfire, cementing the Borgia Pope's reputation for hedonism. The whispers, that had once been confined to the palaces of Rome, were now being shouted from the pulpits of Florence. A fiery Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola openly preached against the corruption of the papacy, calling Alexander VI the Antichrist and a servant of Satan. He accused the Pope of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, of lust, greed, and every sin imaginable. Savonarola's sermons resonated with a public growing weary of the church's immense wealth and moral decay. For a time, he became a powerful enemy, a moral counterpoint to the Borgia excesses. But no one crossed the Borgias and survived for long. Eventually, Pope Alexander had Savonarola excommunicated, arrested, and burned at the stake. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Yet, despite his power, he could not silence the truth. Every political maneuver, every lavish banquet, every title given to a son or marriage arranged for a daughter further eroded the moral authority of the papacy. The faithful of Europe were beginning to see the man on St. Peter's throne not as a holy father, but a corrupt king who wore the robes of a priest. The damage was profound, creating deep cracks in the foundation of the church, cracks that within a generation would shatter it completely.
The Borgia Empire, built on a foundation of conspiracy and fear, was as brilliant as it was unstable. As Alexander aged, the intricate web he had woven began to fray. The first devastating blow came from within his own family. In 1497, his favorite son, Giovanni, the Duke of Gandia, vanished. A few days later, his body was pulled from the Tiber River, riddled with stab wounds. The Pope was shattered by grief, his anguished cries echoing through the Vatican halls. An investigation was launched, but it was quickly and mysteriously shut down. The rumors were immediate and horrifying. The murderer was none other than Giovanni's own brother, Cesare. The motive? Jealousy. Cesare, the brilliant but landless cardinal, envied the titles and military command his less competent brother had been given. While never proven, the suspicion hung in the air, a testament to the venomous ambition that Alexander himself had nurtured in his children. The family that was meant to be his crowning achievement was now devouring itself. This tragedy seemed to push Alexander and Cesare into an even more desperate and ruthless phase. With Giovanni gone, Cesare became the sole focus of his father's dynastic dreams. He left the church and became a secular prince, his campaigns growing more brutal, his methods more cruel. The Pope, in turn, became more brazen in his efforts to fund them. He created and sold dozens of new cardinal positions, auctioned off church offices to the highest bidder, and seized the wealth of his enemies on trumped-up charges. The sacred had become purely transactional. The spiritual authority of the papacy was now little more than a fundraising mechanism for Cesare's army. The shockwaves were felt across Europe. In Spain, Queen Isabella, a devout Catholic, was horrified. In Germany and France, rulers and theologians began to question whether a man so utterly consumed by worldly power could truly be the vicar of Christ. The printing press, a new and powerful technology, helped spread pamphlets and woodcuts depicting the Pope as a monster, a gluttonous tyrant, and even a demon wearing the papal crown. The respect and awe that the papacy had commanded for 1,000 years was evaporating. Common people began to wonder, if the head of the church was so corrupt, what did that say about the church itself? The institution that was supposed to offer salvation from sin was now being led by a man who seemed to personify it. The climax of this dark chapter arrived not on a battlefield, but at a dinner table. In the sweltering summer of 1503, Pope Alexander and his son Cesare attended a banquet hosted by a cardinal. Within days, both men fell violently ill with a fever. Rome, a city of swamps, was rife with malaria, but in a world of Borgia intrigue, everyone immediately suspected poison. Had an enemy finally succeeded where so many had failed? Or had they accidentally consumed a poison they intended for their host? The truth would never be known.
Cesare, younger and stronger, writhed in agony, but eventually recovered. But the Pope, now in his 70s, stood no chance. As he lay on his deathbed, the man who had controlled kings and commanded armies was reduced to a frail, delirious old man. The power he had spent a lifetime accumulating was useless against the advance of death. And the moment the end came, the Vatican exploded into chaos. The carefully constructed facade of order and reverence shattered. Servants and soldiers, loyal only to his power and not his person, immediately ransacked the papal apartments, stripping them of everything valuable. His body was left almost entirely alone. The Pope, who had lived in such splendor, was now an abandoned corpse. The summer heat took its toll quickly, his body decaying at a horrifying rate. It became so grotesquely swollen and disfigured that attendants had to force it into a coffin that was too small, covering the grotesque scene with a tattered cloth. It was a gruesome, undignified end for the most powerful man in Christendom. His death was not met with mourning, but with a palpable sense of relief that washed over the city of Rome. The reign of the Borgia wolf was finally over. Pope Alexander VI's legacy was immediate and devastating. His name became a byword for hypocrisy, his pontificate the ultimate symbol of the Church's moral decay. He had treated the papacy as his personal kingdom and the Church's wealth as his family inheritance. In his relentless pursuit of power for his children, he had exposed the deep corruption at the very heart of the institution. He had shown the world that even the holiest office on earth could be conquered by greed, ambition, and lust. The shock and disillusionment he caused festered in the soul of Europe. Just 14 years after his death, a German monk named Martin Luther would nail his 95 Theses to a church door, igniting the Protestant Reformation and shattering the unity of Western Christendom forever. While many factors led to that historic split, the memory of the Pope who fathered a dynasty in the Vatican shadows was a powerful catalyst. His story serves as a haunting reminder that even in the most sacred of places, the most profound darkness can take root. If you enjoyed this untold story, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden History of Human Race for more hidden voices from history.